On a peaceful street, where even the gentle rustling of leaves could be heard in the early morning stillness, lay a small, unassuming neighborhood. This was a place where children's laughter often echoed down narrow lanes, and the sweet aroma of baked goods from the nearby bakery tempted passers-by. It was a modest area where hardworking people lived, content with the simplicity of life they'd managed to create. Among them was Clara, a woman who carried an undeniable warmth and a quiet strength that others easily noticed and admired. Clara was in her last trimester of pregnancy, and with each step, she seemed to walk with a sense of purpose, her hand instinctively cradling her belly. Her face radiated both determination and the unmistakable glow of motherhood. Clara's presence in the neighborhood was like a comforting constant. Neighbors often paused to wave or share a few words with her. She had a gentle kindness that people were drawn to, a smile that could soften even the hardest of hearts. Clara was not only a friend to many but also a role model in her own way. She had a way of showing up for people, always ready with a word of encouragement, a small gesture of support, or even just a reassuring nod that somehow conveyed, "I understand and I'm here." Yet, Clara's life had not been without its challenges. She had known hardships and obstacles, both subtle and blatant, and yet she met each one with resilience and grace. Her husband, Marcus, was her unwavering pillar of support, a man whose quiet strength and loyalty mirrored her own. They had a bond that had been shaped by mutual respect, understanding, and a shared journey through life's ups and downs. Marcus worked tirelessly to provide for their growing family, spending long hours at his job, always driven by the desire to build a brighter future for his wife and their soon-to-arrive child. Clara knew the sacrifices he made, and she appreciated every effort, often leaving him small notes of encouragement to find in his lunch bag or on the kitchen counter. The love they shared was the kind that wasn't just in words but in actions. Every evening, despite his exhaustion, Marcus would take Clara on a short walk through the neighborhood, knowing how much she enjoyed the fresh air and the chance to stretch her legs. As they strolled, they would talk about their dreams, their fears, and the life they envisioned for their little one. They both wanted nothing more than a world where their child could grow up safe, valued, and free to pursue their dreams. They dreamed of a place where kindness and understanding outweighed the prejudice they sometimes felt hovering around them like a dark cloud. Clara's life had taught her strength, but it had also taught her to remain hopeful. Despite the world's imperfections, she believed that things could improve, that change was possible. As a black woman, Clara was no stranger to the quiet struggles that came with her identity. She had faced her share of judgmental glances, whispered assumptions, and biases that subtly cast shadows over her everyday experiences. Marcus, too, had endured these struggles, and together, they had learned to navigate them with grace. Their determination to create a better world for their child was partly born from a deep-seated desire to shield their future generation from the prejudices they had encountered. As Clara's pregnancy progressed, her anticipation grew, mingling with a touch of anxiety about the world her child would enter. She often found herself daydreaming about her little one, about the values she would instill, the stories she would tell, and the lessons she would teach. Clara wanted her child to be strong yet kind, resilient yet compassionate. She longed to protect her baby from the harsher realities she knew all too well, even though she also understood the impossibility of sheltering them entirely. The neighborhood, with its familiar faces and friendly chatter, was a sanctuary for Clara. It was a place where, despite everything, she felt at peace. Yet, as her belly grew and her connection to her unborn child deepened, Clara began to notice the tiny cracks in that sense of security. The incidents were small but significant: the sideways glances from strangers, the faintly condescending tone of someone commenting on her pregnancy, as if questioning her worthiness as a mother. Even within her own neighborhood, Clara felt an undercurrent of judgment that reminded her of the world's darker sides. One day, as she strolled down the street alone, a faint unease settled over her. She tried to shake it off, attributing it to pregnancy nerves, but the feeling lingered. There was something about the quiet around her, a silence that felt almost too still. Clara couldn't quite pinpoint the source of her discomfort, but she felt it in her bones, a mother's intuition that whispered a warning she couldn't ignore. She brushed a hand over her belly, as if to reassure both herself and her unborn child. "Everything will be okay," she murmured softly, as much for her own comfort as for her baby's. But deep down, Clara couldn't deny the nagging worry that perhaps the world wasn't ready to be as kind and safe as she hoped. Her thoughts drifted to Marcus and the conversations they'd had about the realities of life. They had spoken at length about the challenges, the unfair assumptions, and the ways they'd had to fight for their place in society. They had made a silent pact to always stand strong, to teach their child resilience and courage, but Clara couldn't help but wish that such teachings weren't necessary. For now, she tried to push those thoughts away, focusing on the love that surrounded her and the hope that grew within her. Marcus would be home soon, and they would walk together, talking about the future, dreaming of all the wonderful things that lay ahead. She took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs as she looked up at the sky, whispering a small prayer that her child would never have to know the pain of prejudice, that they would grow up in a world that valued them for who they were. Yet Clara couldn't shake the feeling that change was on the horizon, that the life she and Marcus had so carefully built was about to be tested in ways they hadn't foreseen. And as she turned to head back home, the quiet peace of the neighborhood felt just a bit more fragile, as if it too sensed the storm brewing on the horizon. The air seemed charged with an invisible tension, a foreshadowing that, in time, would reveal itself and force Clara to summon every ounce of strength she had. In that moment, Clara's life was calm, her heart filled with love, but just beneath the surface lay the reality of a world that was still learning to see past its prejudices. And though she didn't know it yet, soon she would be called upon to protect her family in ways she never imagined, facing challenges that would test not only her resilience but also the very foundation of her beliefs in justice and humanity. In the early hours of an overcast afternoon, Clara walked down her usual path, lost in thought as she hummed a lullaby to her unborn child. The sky was painted a dull gray, reflecting a mood that Clara couldn't quite shake off. Just as she turned the corner onto a quieter street, her path was unexpectedly blocked by the sight of a police car parked at an angle, as if carelessly abandoned. Her steps slowed instinctively, her heartbeat quickening as she noticed an officer standing by the vehicle, arms crossed, watching her approach. This officer was someone she hadn't seen in the neighborhood before. His demeanor was far from welcoming. Instead, there was an unmistakable air of dismissiveness about him, an expression that barely concealed the disdain in his eyes as he looked her up and down. Clara felt a chill run down her spine, but she steadied herself, offering a polite nod as she moved to step past him. "Hold on there," the officer's voice was gruff, and the command in his tone made her stop in her tracks. His eyes bore into her with a coldness that felt unnervingly personal. Clara's breath hitched as she turned to face him fully, trying to keep her expression calm, though a flicker of unease crossed her features. "Yes, officer. Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, her voice steady but soft. He raised an eyebrow, looking at her as though she'd somehow insulted him merely by existing. "Are you from around here?" he asked, his words laced with suspicion that seemed unnecessary. Clara forced a small smile, though she felt her pulse quicken. "Yes, I live just a few blocks away," she replied, keeping her tone respectful. She hoped this would be a brief exchange, just a few questions, and she'd be on her way. But the officer didn't seem interested in letting her go so easily. He took a step closer, his gaze narrowing. "Funny, I haven't seen you around," he said, his words slow and deliberate. There was something unsettling in the way he looked at her, as though he was challenging her right to be there. Clara's grip tightened around the handle of her small grocery bag. "Well, I walk this route almost every day," she said, her voice calm but firmer now. She could feel her heart pounding, but she forced herself to stand her ground, unwilling to let him intimidate her. The officer's eyes drifted to her rounded belly, a hint of disdain flickering across his face. "You people," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Clara's cheeks flushed, both with anger and embarrassment. She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, unsure of how to react without escalating the situation. This first encounter left a bitter taste in her mouth. As she finally managed to walk away, she felt his gaze follow her until she was well out of sight. She took a few deep breaths, trying to shake off the discomfort that lingered. Clara hoped that was the end of it, but a part of her knew this wouldn't be the last time she'd see him. Days later, Clara encountered him again. She was on her way home, carrying a small bouquet of flowers she had bought for herself, a small token to brighten her day. As she approached the same street corner, she spotted him leaning against his patrol car, watching her intently. Her steps faltered, but she forced herself to keep walking, determined not to show any fear. The officer straightened, stepping into her path with a deliberate slowness that sent a chill down her spine. "Back again, I see," he said, his voice laced with a mocking edge. "Where are you off to this time?" Clara forced herself to maintain eye contact, even though every instinct told her to avoid his gaze. "Just heading home," she replied, her voice clipped but polite. He scoffed, looking her up and down in a way that felt intrusive, as though he was dissecting her with his gaze. "Doesn't seem like you belong around here," he remarked, his tone dripping with a thinly veiled hostility. The words struck her like a physical blow. Clara felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she quickly swallowed it down, knowing that reacting would likely make things worse. "I've lived here for years," she said, her voice as steady as she could manage. But the officer wasn't interested in her answers. He smirked, leaning in closer. "Is that so? Or are you just passing through, causing trouble?" Clara's hands trembled slightly, but she gripped the flowers tighter, focusing on keeping her composure. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I think you're mistaken, officer," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He let out a short laugh, clearly unimpressed. "I don't think I am. I see your type all the time," he sneered, his eyes flashing with a cold contempt that was impossible to ignore. The encounter left her shaken, and as she finally managed to walk past him, she felt her heart pounding in her chest, the anger and helplessness swirling within her like a storm. She wished Marcus were there, wished she could lean on his steady presence to help her brush off this man's venomous words. But Marcus wasn't there, and she knew she had to find her own strength in moments like these. Over the next few days, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She avoided that street corner, taking different routes in the hope of avoiding him. But somehow, he always seemed to find her. His words became sharper, more direct, his sneers more pointed. It wasn't long before his actions escalated small infractions at first, barely noticeable to others but glaringly clear to Clara. A slight nudge as he walked past her, a sarcastic comment about her attitude, his mocking gaze whenever she dared to walk her usual route. One afternoon, as she made her way home, her thoughts elsewhere, she suddenly felt a rough hand on her shoulder. She turned, heart racing, to find the officer staring down at her with an expression that could only be described as contemptuous. "What do you think you're doing, walking around here like you own the place?" he demanded, his voice low but filled with a simmering anger that made her blood run cold. Clara's heart pounded as she took a step back, instinctively placing a hand over her belly in a protective gesture. "I'm just going home, officer," she replied, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to appear calm. But the officer wasn't satisfied. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "I don't like your attitude," he spat, his eyes narrowing with a dangerous glint. "People like you think you can just waltz in wherever you want." Before Clara could respond, he lifted his leg and kicked her in the stomach, the force of it sending her stumbling backward. A sharp, agonizing pain shot through her, and she crumpled to the ground, clutching her belly as tears streamed down her face. The world around her seemed to blur, the sounds fading into a distant hum as she tried to process what had just happened. The officer stood over her, his expression one of satisfaction, as if he had just proven some unspoken point. Clara's mind raced, a chaotic mess of fear, anger, and helplessness. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but the pain was too overwhelming. She could only lie there, gasping for breath, praying that her baby was unharmed. Eventually, the officer walked away, leaving her lying on the pavement, broken and defeated. She managed to pull herself up, every movement a struggle, and staggered home, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. When Marcus arrived home later that evening, he found Clara sitting silently on the couch, her eyes red and swollen. The sight of her bruised face and trembling hands filled him with a mixture of horror and rage. He dropped to his knees in front of her, taking her hands in his as he whispered, "What happened, Clara? Who did this to you?" Clara could barely speak through the tears that threatened to overwhelm her. She choked out the story, her voice breaking as she recounted the officer's cruel words, the way he had looked at her with such hatred, and finally the brutal kick that had left her fearing for her unborn child. Marcus's face hardened as he listened, his jaw clenched, his fists tightening with each word. The pain and helplessness in Clara's eyes tore at his heart, and he felt a surge of anger unlike anything he'd ever experienced. How could someone do this to his wife, to the mother of his child? The thought was almost unbearable. He held her close, whispering words of comfort, but inside he was seething. He knew he couldn't let this go unanswered. He had to protect his family, to make sure that the man who had hurt his wife would never have the chance to do it again. Marcus awoke the next morning with a fiery determination, the events of the previous day still fresh in his mind, searing through him with an intensity that made him ache. Clara's tear-stained face, her broken whispers, the deep pain she bore from that awful encounter, all of it haunted him. He knew he couldn't let this pass without taking a stand. His wife had been humiliated, assaulted, and left in a state of fear within her own neighborhood, and his child had been put in harm's way before even entering the world. Marcus was not a man who sought out conflict, but he was prepared to fight for his family. Without hesitation, Marcus drove to the local police precinct, his heart pounding with equal parts fear and determination. The precinct was a stark, cold building, one he'd rarely entered, and certainly never in circumstances like these. He braced himself, squaring his shoulders, and walked up to the front desk where a bored-looking officer sat flipping through papers. "I need to file a complaint," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity that made the officer look up. He held onto his anger, determined to be calm and composed, knowing that he'd need to present himself as clearly as possible to be taken seriously. The officer raised an eyebrow, looking Marcus up and down. "Complaint about what?" he asked, in a tone that bordered on dismissive. Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain civil. "An officer attacked my wife yesterday. She's pregnant. She was harassed and physically assaulted by one of your officers," he said, his voice barely containing the hurt and anger he felt. The officer's expression shifted briefly, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face, but it quickly returned to a blank neutrality. "Do you have any evidence of this assault?" he asked coolly, not even reaching for a form or a pen. Marcus clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. "My wife's word should be enough, but yes, she has bruises. She's traumatized, and I know who did it." It was Officer Harding. The name felt bitter on his tongue, the face of that smug cop flashing in his mind. The officer at the desk looked at him, unimpressed, and simply shrugged. "Without hard evidence, we can't just go around accusing officers of misconduct," he said. "It's your word against his, and frankly, Officer Harding has been with us for years. He's a good man, does his job well." Marcus felt his hope wane, the familiar helplessness creeping in. "He attacked my wife," he insisted, his voice trembling with the effort to control his emotions. "I won't leave here until someone takes my complaint seriously." At that moment, another voice interrupted, low but firm. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus turned to see a tall man in a suit standing nearby, his expression serious but kind. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with a face that bore the marks of experience. His presence radiated authority, and something about him seemed immediately trustworthy. Marcus looked at the man, grasping for words, and explained again, his frustration spilling over as he recounted the events. The man listened intently, nodding as Marcus spoke, and when he finished, he gave Marcus a reassuring nod. "Mr. Jackson, my name is Richard Keene. I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights cases." The man introduced himself, his voice calm yet resolute. "I happened to be passing through, and I couldn't help but overhear." He shot a glance at the desk officer, who looked uncomfortable under his gaze. "Would you be willing to meet me in my office later? I think there may be a way I can help." Marcus was stunned. This stranger, who seemed to understand the gravity of what had happened, was offering his support, and it felt like a glimmer of hope in a sea of darkness. He nodded gratefully, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. Later that day, Marcus found himself in Richard's small but organized office. The attorney listened as Marcus detailed the events again, this time able to let his anger flow freely, knowing he was in the presence of someone who believed him. Richard nodded, deep in thought. "Officer Harding, you said?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "I've heard things about him, complaints, but nothing's ever stuck. He's careful, and frankly, he's had people protecting him." Richard's voice had a tone of quiet disgust. "But it's time someone stood up to him. And I think your story is exactly what we need to expose the truth." A sense of purpose took root in Marcus, fueled by Richard's support. Together, they devised a plan. Richard would gather testimonies from other victims, if he could find them, to build a case that would finally hold Officer Harding accountable. In the meantime, Marcus prepared himself for a confrontation. This wasn't just about justice for his wife, it was about standing up for every person Harding had hurt. A few days later, Marcus found himself back at the precinct, this time with Richard by his side. They had arranged a meeting with Harding, under the pretense of discussing a misunderstanding. The tension in the room was palpable as Harding sauntered in, his gaze cold as it landed on Marcus, then Richard. "What's this about?" Harding asked, his voice dripping with disdain as he looked Marcus up and down, his expression a mocking smirk. Richard wasted no time. "Officer Harding, we're here to discuss your recent actions against Mr. Jackson's wife, Clara," he said, his tone icy and unwavering. "It's time to address your conduct." Harding scoffed, crossing his arms. "Are you serious? This guy's making a fuss over nothing. His wife was probably causing a disturbance." Marcus's fists clenched, but he remained silent, letting Richard take the lead. "Officer Harding," Richard continued, his voice steady, "I've been looking into your record, and it appears that Clara Jackson isn't the first person you've targeted. In fact, we've spoken with a few other individuals who have similar accounts, especially people who, let's just say, don't fit the profile you're comfortable with." Harding's expression shifted, his confidence faltering for the first time. He opened his mouth to speak, but Richard cut him off. "What's more," Richard continued, his voice rising with intensity, "is that we know about the incident from your past. The one you thought you'd hidden." Richard leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "It seems that your behavior is not just a fluke, Officer Harding. It's a pattern of abuse and intimidation." Marcus watched Harding's face drain of color as Richard spoke, the confidence crumbling into something darker, fear, perhaps, or the realization that his actions were finally catching up to him. The twist was one that Marcus hadn't seen coming, but as Richard explained, he began to understand the depth of Harding's twisted motivations. Years ago, Harding had been involved in an incident where he'd assaulted a young black man under similarly dubious circumstances. The man had suffered significant injuries, but the case had been swept under the rug by powerful connections Harding had within the force. Marcus felt a sickening wave of anger and disbelief wash over him. Harding's record, it turned out, was stained with similar incidents that had been carefully covered up, victims who had been silenced. And now, with the right legal leverage, Richard had uncovered enough to bring the truth to light. The silence in the room was thick, and Harding's face twisted in rage as he glared at Marcus and Richard. "You're both making a big mistake," he spat, his voice trembling. "I have friends in high places." But Richard stood his ground, undeterred. "You're not above the law, Harding. You may have friends, but we have the truth. And this time it's not going away." He turned to Marcus, giving him a slight nod of encouragement, and Marcus took a deep breath, finding his voice. "You attacked my wife. You threatened our future, and you thought you'd get away with it," Marcus said, his voice strong and unyielding. "But this ends now. We're not backing down." As Harding's face contorted with fury, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of empowerment. He had confronted the man who had hurt his family, and with Richard's support, he knew they had a real chance at justice. The weight that had been pressing down on him for days finally began to lift, replaced by a fierce determination to see this through. Richard leaned forward, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "Expect to hear from us soon, Officer Harding. This isn't over." With that, Richard and Marcus turned, leaving Harding behind, his threats echoing uselessly in their wake. As they stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, Marcus felt a sense of hope return, stronger than ever. They had taken the first step toward holding Harding accountable, and for the first time Marcus believed that justice was truly within reach. The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of activity and emotions. Richard wasted no time filing the official complaints, backed by evidence he had gathered from past victims. News of Officer Harding's misconduct spread quickly, first through quiet conversations in the precinct, then outward, as the press picked up the story. A local journalist, eager to shed light on systemic issues within the police department, published an article titled, "Justice Served, Courageous Family Confronts Abusive Officer." The article detailed Harding's history, his unchecked power, and how, finally, someone had taken a stand against him. Within hours, the article was shared widely, causing an uproar in the community. The impact on the precinct was immediate. Harding was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and whispers filled the hallways. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to Harding's behavior now found themselves under scrutiny, fearful that their association with him might bring their own reputations into question. The precinct's leadership, eager to maintain public trust, made an official statement acknowledging the accusations and promising a thorough investigation. It was a carefully crafted message meant to protect the department's image, but Marcus and Clara saw through the formality. For them, this was a small victory, a step toward justice, even if it felt long overdue. Clara's emotions were a mix of relief and lingering pain. She had always believed in forgiveness and second chances, yet what Harding had done was beyond her understanding. The betrayal cut deeply, leaving wounds that weren't easy to heal. But the knowledge that he was finally facing consequences offered her a sense of closure. She sat with Marcus one evening, a small smile breaking through her usually serious expression. "I didn't think this day would come," she murmured, leaning into him. Marcus wrapped an arm around her, his own relief evident in his softened demeanor. "Neither did I," he admitted, his voice filled with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet pride. "But we did it, Clara. We stood up for ourselves and for our child." He placed a gentle hand on her belly, feeling a newfound strength radiate between them. For him, this was about more than Harding. It was a moment of reclaiming their dignity, of ensuring their child would grow up with parents who wouldn't back down in the face of injustice. They both took a moment to breathe, processing the roller coaster they'd been on. Clara closed her eyes, remembering the fear and pain she'd felt in that terrible moment, but then letting it go, focusing on the strength she'd found within herself. "Maybe this will make a difference," she whispered, more to herself than to Marcus, a hope blossoming in her heart that perhaps, just perhaps, their actions would inspire others to stand up as well. Meanwhile, the reaction from their community was overwhelming. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers rallied around them, offering words of support and solidarity. The story had resonated deeply, especially among those who had experienced similar mistreatment or felt silenced by the weight of discrimination. The neighborhood, once quiet and reserved, became a place of unity and open discussion, with people coming together to express their outrage over the injustice and their admiration for the courage Marcus and Clara had shown. A small gathering was organized in front of Marcus and Clara's house one evening. Friends, family, and supportive neighbors gathered, lighting candles as a symbol of solidarity. They formed a close-knit circle, sharing stories of resilience and standing up against oppression. People of all backgrounds came together, showing their support for the family's bravery. Marcus and Clara, standing at the center, felt a warmth that went beyond words. One of their neighbors, Mrs. Green, an elderly woman who had known Clara since she was a child, approached them with a tearful smile. "You two have shown this neighborhood what it means to be strong," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "We're proud of you, and we're here for you." Always her words brought Clara to tears, as she realized just how much her actions had meant not only to herself and her family but to the entire community. As the evening went on, Marcus and Clara listened to others share their own experiences with injustice, many of which had been previously buried in silence. The gathering became a safe space for healing, where people could voice their pain and find comfort in each other's stories. The community's support was a balm to Clara's heart, reminding her that they were not alone, that their fight for justice resonated with so many others who had also yearned for change. The support extended beyond just the neighborhood. News outlets covered the story, and online a movement began to grow. People shared the story of Marcus and Clara's bravery, spreading the message that standing up against injustice, no matter how daunting, was possible. Messages flooded in from people they had never met, expressing solidarity, admiration, and even sharing similar stories of their own struggles. The weight of Harding's actions, and the accountability now placed upon him, sparked a broader conversation about systemic issues, inspiring a call for reform within the police department. The precinct's leadership faced mounting pressure to take meaningful action. The investigation into Harding's conduct expanded to include other instances of misconduct, and soon, additional officers were implicated in covering up or ignoring Harding's abuses. Public pressure, combined with the unwavering support of Marcus and Clara's community, left the department with no choice but to enforce stricter policies and training focused on accountability and respect. For Marcus and Clara, the journey was far from over. The memory of what had happened would linger, and there were days when the trauma felt as raw as it had on that first day. But as they looked out at the faces of those who had stood by them, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had made a difference, not only for themselves but for their child, who would grow up in a world where their parents had fought for justice. One afternoon, Clara sat in her kitchen, writing in a journal she had started for her child. She wrote about the values she wanted to instill: courage, resilience, kindness, and the importance of standing up for what was right. As she penned each word, she felt a calmness settle over her, knowing that one day her child would read these words and understand the strength it took to bring them into a world that wasn't always kind, but where change was always possible. Marcus, too, felt changed. He had faced fear and vulnerability in ways he'd never anticipated, but he'd emerged with a sense of pride and conviction. He knew that the battle for justice didn't end with Harding's investigation. It was a call to remain vigilant, to continue speaking out for those who couldn't, and to nurture the community that had stood by them in their time of need. The following weeks brought a quiet peace to Marcus and Clara's lives, but they knew that their actions had left a lasting impact. They had confronted a painful truth, endured heartbreak, and emerged stronger than ever. And while they couldn't change the world overnight, they had taken the first steps toward making it a safer, more just place for their family and their community. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm, but with a renewed sense of unity and purpose. The collective memory of what Marcus and Clara had done lingered in every heart, a reminder that even in the face of fear, there is strength to be found in solidarity and in the relentless pursuit of justice. In the days and weeks that followed, Marcus and Clara began to feel the burdens of fear and anger gradually lifting from their lives. The shadows that once loomed over them were slowly replaced by a profound sense of peace. They had faced a nightmare and come out the other side, stronger than before. The journey had changed them, but it had also brought them closer together, reinforcing the unbreakable bond they shared. In the quiet moments, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, there was a newfound lightness in their hearts, a feeling of liberation, of finally being seen, and of standing up not just for themselves but for their child and their community. Clara found herself feeling lighter with each passing day. Though the memories of that terrible encounter lingered, she could feel the healing begin to take root. Her days were no longer filled with fear and doubt. Instead, they were filled with purpose and the assurance that she and Marcus had done something meaningful. She often rested a hand on her belly, whispering small promises to her child about the world they would bring them into, a world where justice, compassion, and resilience would be the cornerstones of their upbringing. Clara knew that her child would grow up learning the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter how daunting the challenge. For Marcus, the journey had uncovered a strength within him he hadn't known existed. He'd always considered himself a quiet man, one who preferred to go about life without stirring waves. But now he knew that sometimes making waves was necessary to create change. His love for Clara and their unborn child had given him the courage to stand up, and he felt a deep sense of pride for having protected his family in a way that truly mattered. There was a powerful clarity in his purpose, and he was more determined than ever to be a force of support and guidance for his family and his community. The sense of victory culminated one warm Saturday evening when the community gathered to celebrate not just Marcus and Clara's courage, but the solidarity that had united them all. The neighborhood park, usually quiet at this time of day, was alive with the laughter and chatter of families, friends, and neighbors who had come together to honor the resilience of two people who had faced adversity and shown them all the power of unity. At the center of the gathering, a small stage had been set up with a microphone. Marcus and Clara were ushered to the front, both humbled by the support that surrounded them. Standing before their community, Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. He looked out at the familiar faces, each one a testament to the strength that people could find when they came together. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you, all of you, for standing with us," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. This journey was one we never expected, and there were times when it felt like too much. But seeing each of you here, knowing that we weren't alone in this, that made all the difference. He paused, looking at Clara, who gave him a gentle nod of encouragement. What we went through was painful, but it taught us something valuable. It taught us that sometimes you have to stand up, even when it's hard, even when it feels impossible, and you don't have to do it alone. We all have each other. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Marcus could see tears in some eyes, nods of encouragement from others. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. I hope that if anyone here faces something similar, if you feel like you've been wronged, or if you see someone being mistreated, that you'll remember this moment. Remember that together we can create change. Together we can stand against injustice and make the world a better place. Clara stepped forward then, her hand resting on her belly, a smile illuminating her face. We did this for ourselves, yes, she said, her voice gentle but clear. But we also did it for the future, for our child, for every child here who deserves to grow up in a world that values justice and kindness. She glanced down at her belly, a sense of pride radiating from her. We want our child to know that they are part of a community that stands for what is right. The crowd erupted into applause, their faces reflecting admiration, pride, and the warmth of shared conviction. One by one, people approached Marcus and Clara, offering words of gratitude and support, expressing how their bravery had inspired others. Friends they'd known for years and neighbors they barely knew stood by them, sharing in their victory, a testament to the strength of community and solidarity. As the sun began to set, the crowd held up candles, illuminating the gathering with a warm, gentle light. It was a symbolic act, a promise to uphold justice, compassion, and resilience. Each flickering flame represented the power of unity and the strength that came from standing together. In that moment, Clara and Marcus felt a profound sense of closure, a reassurance that their fight had not been in vain. As they stood among their friends and neighbors, Marcus put his arm around Clara, a gentle smile on his face. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but they also knew they were no longer alone. Together, with the support of their community, they were prepared to face whatever came next with courage and hope. For everyone watching, their story was a reminder of the power of resilience, of standing up for one's family and community. It was a call to action, a testament to the impact one family's courage could have on those around them. As they took one final moment to address the crowd, Marcus offered a parting message. Thank you for being here, for listening, for supporting us, and for believing that change is possible. We hope our story reminds you to stand up for what you believe in. And if you've ever felt alone in your struggles, remember that you're not. You have people who care, people who are willing to stand beside you. Clara added with a soft smile, this is just the beginning. Let's continue to work together to build a better world, not just for us, but for our children and for the generations to come. As they said their goodbyes, the community began to disperse, each person carrying with them the inspiration of the evening. The story of Marcus and Clara would live on in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, a lasting reminder of resilience, unity, and the power of standing up against adversity. And to the audience watching from afar, this story is a reminder to stand together, to support one another, and to never be afraid to seek justice. If this story resonated with you, we encourage you to share your thoughts, reflect on the power of community, and join us in spreading messages of hope, strength, and change. Let's keep inspiring each other, one story at a time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more uplifting tales of resilience and courage. Together we can make a difference.